Endings. We all hate them. When we finally reach the end to something, whether it be a long-running show, graduation, or a relationship, we cannot help but look back on all the time we've got to spend with that individual or product. Yet, they're more necessary than we like to think. Take a look at fucking SpongeBob and Fairly OddParents. While they started out as classics, when they were prolonged for a lengthy amount of time, they just got stale. They added in too many characters, and a new sense of humor was really cringy. Soon, the old audience they once had moved on to other things. Now, I wouldn't say that Ratchet and Clank as a series is headed down the exact same route, but let me tell you, they had the perfect opportunity to end a franchise with a crack in time, and they just didn't. They released back-to-back spin-offs with All for One and Full Frontal Assault. There was an epilogue that left off as a cliffhanger with Into the Nexus, and while I hear good things about Rift Apart, it seemingly neglected a crack in time and failed to bring closure to the mystery behind the Lombaxes. Maybe a crack in time still had some unanswered questions, but that was okay, because if there was anything the ending solidified, it was that Ratchet and Clank were an inseparable duo. So even though they didn't know everything, they always had each other. And to me, that's the best send-off the series has ever had since the first game. To add to that, A Crack in Time has an insane amount of polish, with the gameplay being the most fun it's ever been. Sure, maybe the story is weighed down by some of the issues carried by Tools of Destruction, but even in that area, its narrative shortcomings are far outweighed by all the good attributes. They say that you should finish off strong, and A Crack in Time would have been the perfect way to have done just that, and I'm here to explain why. Taking place where Quest for Booty left off, Ratchet and Tolwyn learn that Clank is in the hands of Dr. Nefarious. The old doctor attempts to pry into Clank's brain to extract information on the Orvis chamber, but he ends up getting locked out. The Zoni try to interfere, telling him that such information is classified. In retaliation, Dr. Nefarious sends out the Hypersonic Brainwave Strangler! Unfortunately, while it drives out the Zoni, it also awakens Clank, who attempts to flee before Nefarious intercepts him. It's here that we learn that the Zoni have taken Clank to the Great Clock with the intent of having him learn about his true destiny as its caretaker. Of course, Nefarious doesn't want to divulge too much information, so he has Clank be incapacitated for the time being. Meanwhile, Ratchet is traveling with Quark. Wait a minute, where's Tolwyn? Yeah, this is kind of a small gripe because in the last game she was accompanying him, and now, all of a sudden, he's with Quark. Did she have some other matter to take care of? Was she too traumatized by her experience being kidnapped by Captain Darkwater? We don't know. All we know is that Quark's now in her place, and it's a little bit bothersome. At least for me. Thankfully, it doesn't last too long as the two become separated. The big plot point for Ratchet is the epiphany that he isn't the last Lombax in his dimension. This other Lombax that he meets is Alistair Azimuth, who was exiled for trusting Emperor Tachyon, which allowed him to do a Lombax genocide before they moved to a different dimension. Carrying a lot of guilt for this, he hopes to use the Great Clock to reverse this mistake, which makes him join Ratchet in his search for Clank, because, as we learn later, Clank is the son of the creator of the Great Clock and is the next in line to inherit it. So the story goes back and forth between Ratchet and Clank's perspectives. To start with the negatives, it carries a lot of the problems Tools of Destruction had, in which none of the plot points had a build-up and are haphazardly introduced. The lore behind the Great Clock feels rushed, as it never even got a mention in the previous games, so the backstory is kind of dumped on us all at once. Basically, since the Fungoids' constant time traveling caused a rupture in the time-space continuum, the sentient being Orvis designed the clock to repair the damage. However, it cannot properly function without a caretaker, and that is supposed to be the destiny of Clank, a role passed from Orvis to him. This would make him Clank's father. Okay, so this presents itself with quite a few conundrums on its own. Wasn't Clank supposed to be a defective robot born on the planet Quartu? Didn't we meet Clank's mom in the first game? So is this implying that Orvis interacted, for lack of a better word, with the computer to produce Clank? It's just also confusing and retcons quite a bit of Clank's origin story. This also takes away from what made Ratchet and Clank such a likable pair in the first place. There was this down-to-earth aspect that came with the fact that these were two ordinary individuals that just happened to come together by chance and kicked some ass. There wasn't even a hint that the two of them had some deep lore behind them. The originals thrived with this simplicity. In fact, the concepts that were more subtle, like the criticism of consumerist culture, is nowhere to be found in the future trilogy. Tools of Destruction and A Crack in Time were basically the beginning phases of when Ratchet and Clank was starting to become what it was satirizing. It tried so hard to be this epic Pixar film, and I wouldn't say it's bad, but I think it's definitely a step backwards from what Ratchet and Clank once was. But having said all that, while lore-wise it doesn't make much sense, the story itself is actually quite good. The new characters are very well written, which makes up for their awkward inclusion. Azimuth's backstory is very tragic. He forever carries around a guilt that weighs him down. He's generally well-intentioned, wanting Ratchet to be reunited with his family. Because of this, we initially root for his plan to use the clock to go back in time and correct his mistake. But there's only one problem.
Under no circumstances is it to be used as a time machine. The clock is not meant to alter time, only to keep it.
Therefore, Azimuth's ambitions were misguided. Rather than being an evil villain, he strikes me as somebody who isn't thinking straight. Somebody who's so distracted by his past failure that he's unable to see the reality of the present. And the game really does a solid job at demonstrating the trauma his guilt was causing him. For instance, Ratchet eventually stops following Azimuth's lead when Clank warns him the clock was never meant to be used for time travel. Azimuth tries to protest, but Ratchet's mind is set, not wanting to take a risk. As a result, Azimuth kills Ratchet.
Holy shit.
That's right, they fucking went there. Well, maybe not quite, for Clank brings him back by traveling 6 minutes into the past. Still, I'm glad that they didn't do that whole fake-out like they did with Al's supposed death. I mean, turning into a robot to preserve yourself? Please. At least with A Crack in Time, they have a logical explanation as to how Ratchet gets brought back. What follows is quite honestly one of the best boss fights in the series, with Azimuth and Ratchet fighting while the clock falls apart. His moveset describes how insane Azimuth has become, with him picking up fallen debris and throwing it at Ratchet, charging at him with the hover boots, and trying to slam him to the ground, all while lightning flashes around them. But then we knock some sense into him, and that forlorn look when Ratchet tries to correct him always gets me. All these years, he'd worked for a goal that was impossible to achieve, and to see him sacrifice himself to fix the clock ultimately redeems him as he prevents himself from making an even bigger mistake than before. For a character that only appears in one game, Alistair Azimuth has more development compared to any of the other major characters in the series. But then we get to Dr. Nefarious, and he's a hit and miss this time around. In one sense, it looks like Insomniac upped the ante in certain areas of his character to make him truly live up to his name. He seems to be a bit smarter this time around, as he manages to trick the Fongoids into trusting him before enslaving all of them, as well as luring Orvis into a trap to get him to lead him to the location of the Timekeeper to the Great Clock. Seriously, he's far more sinister and competent this time around in enacting his plans. The fundamental problem lies with what he wants to do with the clock. His evil plan is just simply not evil enough. He simply desires to reverse all the victories heroes were able to have so that the villains would win instead. That's it. Whatever happened to his goal of robot supremacy? A plan that would have made a lot more sense for him is that he goes back in time and tries to undo his previous defeat at the hand of Ratchet, which would allow his plan to make everyone a robot come to fruition. Or, better yet, his plan would involve him going way, way back in the past and making robots superior to humans instead of the other way around. But a bad evil plan doesn't quite ruin him, because the good old Doctor is back with Armin Shimmerman just killing it again. Whether it be Lance and Janice taking over every time he screamed, "Quark!" It's just more of the same good stuff we got backing up your arsenal. Unfortunately, the villains that supplement him don't get similar treatment. Lord Vorslon may sound menacing being an assassin and all, but he doesn't really do anything except get his ass handed to him 3 times. I guess he kidnaps Azimuth and zaps him. Oh yeah, that's really threatening. But we save him like it's nothing. To sum up my thoughts on him, let me share a little quote from Dr. Nefarious.
How could you be so utterly incompetent?
The Valkyries don't really have much of a presence either. Karina, Cassiopeia, and Libra seem to appear as if they're going to be a formidable challenge for Ratchet and Azimuth, but Karina and Libra are both demolished in space battles, so we don't get to meet them in person, which left Cassiopeia as the only one we fought on foot. And in this quick fight, we don't really get to know her as a character. Irrelevant and unnecessary are 2 words that perfectly describe how they're used in the game. Essentially, they barely register as a threat because of how little they appear. But then we come to the biggest elephant in the room, and that's the explanation behind Clank's origin story. So, while I feel like this just comes out of the blue, there are parts that I like about it. Basically, Clank hits a crossroad as he struggles to decide if he wants to embrace his destiny as the caretaker and separate from Ratchet for good. Honestly, this conflict is one that I've never really seen before in the series, and it's impactful because this duo has been through so much together that to see them potentially separate is heartbreaking. The game does a pretty good job at conveying that this isn't an easy decision for Clank. I really like this conversation he has with the plumber because it has some decent symbolism demonstrating Clank's maturity. The pipe representing the next big step he needs to take, and Ratchet's Omni-Wrench clogging it, demonstrating how Ratchet is a friend he struggles to let go. That being said, I wish this part was done with Sigmund instead of the plumber, mostly because the plumber wasn't really a character that you were meant to have deep conversations with. He was designed to be more of a goofy Easter egg character, while Sigmund is the junior caretaker trying to lead Clank in the right direction of taking on this new role. It's wasted potential that he seems to be treated as more of a lighthearted joke character instead of a mentor figure. I mean, he does try to teach Clank a lot about the clock, but he doesn't really do much to address his conflict of letting go of Ratchet. But the biggest wasted potential is that they chose not to end it all here. Yes, I know that Ratchet still hasn't found his family and race, but let me remind you, he said this.
But the past stays where it is.
So, at the end of the day, he'd made peace with his status as an orphan, and Clank decides not to leave him because he knew he was the only family that Ratchet would ever have at the end of the day. The duo flying out into the distance on a Philion is as iconic of a closing as the series ever gets. So they could have done 2 things. Either they conclude the series here or try to continue the story in some way, and they chose the latter. Yeah, the results were kind of mixed. I've never played All for One and Full Frontal Assault, but to my knowledge, those games added nothing. I've played Into the Nexus, and I thought that game sort of felt like a good epilogue that further explored Ratchet's conflicted feelings of not knowing his family, but mind you, that the conclusion was very similar to that of A Crack in Time, in which he'd come to terms with it, understanding that there were more important things in his current life. Granted, it does end with a cliffhanger with Clank taking the Dimensionator, and that leads to Rift Apart. And don't ask me about that one because I've also never played it, but I hear it leaves a lot more questions than answers regarding Ratchet's race. I guess more the reason I feel A Crack in Time should have been the end, or maybe at least to the whole last Lombax arc, because it sort of feels like Insomniac is just prolonging it more and more with no actual feeling of closure in sight. But, while I may have sounded somewhat mixed on the story, I've gotta say the gameplay is probably the most fun I've had in a Ratchet and Clank game. It manages to take the third-person shooting and platforming elements from previous entries and add some new features to make the series fresh. So, Ratchet has some new weapons. I guess I'll rank these from worst to best. At the top of the list at number 17 is the Plasma Striker. The reason this is the worst gun is because, as another sniper rifle in the series, it now has a new feature in which it allows you to target an enemy's weak point. Hypothetically, you can just shoot at point blank, but you wouldn't be maximizing the amount of damage you could be doing. Since enemies are constantly moving about and firing at you, it's hard to take aim at that specific point unless you freeze them in place with cryo mines. And speaking of which, number 16 are the cryo mines. Yeah, it really sucks trying to level these up, because most of the time, it just freezes the enemies in place. Technically, they do take damage every time they're frozen, but it takes forever for them to die. Usually they work best if combined with another weapon. Number 15 is the Constructo Pistol. Most of the Ratchet and Clank starting weapons usually have a tendency to wear out their usefulness in the middle of the game, and the Constructo pistol is no exception. Something that you can do that you weren't able to in the previous Ratchet and Clanks is the option to attach mods onto these starting weapons. These actually help make the weapons not feel as bad to use in the late game. Unfortunately, it doesn't really save the Constructo pistol, as its damage tends to be really pitiful compared to the rest of your weaponry, no matter what mod you attach onto it. At number 14, we have the Dynamo of Doom. The large ball of energy it unleashes is pretty devastating and does a solid amount of damage. However, it requires you to use the 6-axis controls to move it, therefore it has the same problem that the tornado launcher has, in which the fact that it's hard to maneuver prevents it from being able to reach its fullest potential. Number 13 is the Spiral of Death. This one is quite interesting because it was the winner for the My Blaster Runs Hot competition, in which several players of the Ratchet and Clank fandom submitted multiple weapons to Insomniac Games in hopes of getting their creations into the game. I'm surprised that the Spiral of Death was the winner, because to be honest, it's not really that creative. All it does is send out a spinning blade that returns to the user. A cool feature is that it can hit other enemies on its way back, so there is a bit of skill involved to properly utilize it. Other than that, it's pretty much a boring version of the Buzzblades. Number 12 is the Rift Inducer 5000. The main reason I was disappointed with this weapon has to do with that it took quite a few hits from the tentacles, otherwise known as Fred, in order for the enemies to be sucked into the black hole. I also felt like the range wasn't very good. A couple times after chucking one of the black holes out, the enemy would move a little bit to the side out of Fred's range, which would make it feel like a wasted shot. I guess it gets better after leveling it up a bit, but that could take some time considering the issues this gun has. Now we're coming to the mid-tier weapons, and at number 11 is the Constructo Bomb. It does decent damage, and like the pistol, you can attach different mods to improve its stats. I just felt like at the end of the day, it was just another bomb glove. Not too different from the fusion grenade from Tools of Destruction. It packed a punch and caused quite the explosion, but this is just a weapon that we've seen before in previous entries. Number 10 is Mr. Zircon. The Synthenoid carries a lot of personality and was often good for crowd control. Kudos to Insomniac for making him upgradable. However, the only thing that holds him back is the damage he does isn't terribly great, and the duration he lasts isn't too long, which makes his backup feel limited. Number 9 are the Tesla Spikes. This was essentially this game's version of the mini turret gun, except it's even better. Throwing out a bunch of these in close proximity will cause an electric fence to form. Any foe that chooses to walk into it will receive quite a bit of damage upon contact. It was quite good at dealing with those mob fights. Number 8 is the Sonic Eruptor. The cool thing with this gun is that it challenges you to utilize it differently compared to other weapons. Whereas other weapons allowed you to spam their projectiles, the Sonic Eruptor has a focus meter in the center of the screen that dictated how powerful its belch was going to be. Or, as this game likes to call, mating call. If it's charged up, it unleashes a blast that can take up a large proximity of space. If the meter is not charged, the belch ends up being smaller and weaker. It's one of those risk versus reward scenarios. If you wait for the meter to charge, you might take the risk of getting shot at, but it also provides stronger damage at the same time. Overall, this is probably the most creative weapon in the lineup. At number 7, we have the Negotiator. Some people thought that this weapon was nerfed, but honestly, I didn't really see anything different with it compared to its version in Tools of Destruction. It blew shit up and was pretty good at homing in on enemies. I'd say that the added sound effect made it even more satisfying to use.
Nice.
Now we're getting to the weapons that I really adore. Number 6 is the Chimpomatic, because really, you can't go wrong with monkeys. But in all seriousness, while I know that a common complaint with this weapon is that it takes too long to evolve your foes, there was a certain charm with how they turned into cymbal-clapping chimpanzees. For number 5, we have the Groovatron. Not only does this weapon have some sick beats that makes you want to dance the fuck out, but it was also very useful when it came to distracting enemies so that I could land a decisive shot. Plus, it's really funny watching someone as tragic and serious as Azimuth doing the disco with a goofy grin. At number 4, we have the Constructo Shotgun. This is quite possibly the most satisfying version of the shotgun we've seen in a series. Its sound effects have this impact that gives it an umph. Now that's a fucking shotgun. Plus, the mods that you acquire give it a surprisingly solid range and decent damage. Compared to the Constructo pistol and bomb, the shotgun was super refined and fun to use. Number 3 is the magnet launcher. This is a true classic that returns from Tools of Destruction, and it's just as good as it was in that game. Paralyzing your foes while trapping them in an electrical net not only did a lot of solid damage on its own, but it also kept enemies in place, which stopped them from firing at you. This helps me escape from a lot of tight situations, as there were times when an enemy was about to attack, and an expertly timed magnet prevented me from taking a hit. And then we come to the top weapons in A Crack in Time. Number 2 are the Buzzblades. This is another great weapon that returns from Tools of Destruction. Rapid firing them as they bounce across the walls towards your enemies was always fun as fuck. One feature they subtly added with these is the fact that they can now home in on your foes, so that's an improvement over their original conception. And the best weapon in A Crack in Time is the Rhino 5. Seriously, collecting all those schematics is totally worth it, for the weapon you get to wield is one hell of a beast. It also has a lot of quirks that make it stand out from the other rhinos, like Beethoven's Fifth playing in the background, or the missiles firing out of his side that provides this euphoric light show. It's an all-rounder weapon, a perfect reward for all the hard work getting those schematics. And with that, I've covered every weapon in A Crack in Time. Now, I know you guys are probably thinking, what about the gadgets? Don't worry, I was just about to get to those. The first one you get are the hover boots, and these are like the better version of the charge boots. Whereas the charge boots only allow you to dash straight forward, you can accelerate with the hover boots, so you can adjust their speed. You can also go off ramps and bounce off launch pads, so there is some platforming involved, which always feels a lot better than just speeding in a line. After that, you get the Omni Soaker, which allows you to suck up different substances from the environment. I liked how sometimes the game placed you in circumstances that required you to utilize the soaker in different ways. In the beginning, it was mostly for simple tasks like derusting a bolt crank or filling a plant with water so that it could be used as a launcher. However, by the time you arrive at Krell Canyon, you encounter these bugs known as tetramites, which digest everything in their path. Therefore, the only way to work around this is to absorb some of the nectar from the surrounding area and spray it onto the ground so that the tetramites would be more drawn to it than you, allowing you to evade them. They do integrate this with some other factors to make it more interesting. Sometimes you need to lure them to this plant to have them attack it so that it would open up an obstructed path. In another situation, there'd be a bolt crank right next to a tetramite nest, so you'd have to fire several droplets of nectar on the ground to ward them off, as turning a bolt crank takes up a lot of time. So, as you can see, A Crack in Time maintains the creativity with the weapons and gadgets. However, at the same time, there were some things taken away from the previous Ratchet and Clank installments. The colorful NPCs that you encountered in the first and second game are no longer present. They're now limited to just being the Fongoids, Terrachnoids, and these junkyard robots. Like, whatever happened to those other guys? Ever since Up Your Arsenal, the galaxy has been feeling all the more empty. Now, they do make up for this with the intergalactic space travel. Instead of watching a loading scene with Ratchet's Starcruiser flying to a planet, this game allows you to do it on your own. In fact, you can now freely explore space, having the option to visit different planets that often have you navigating platforming challenges to get a special collectible. There are also different radio stations you can listen to as you wander around a galaxy, and that's really helpful. I mean, can you imagine how dead it'd feel if it was just pure silence as you wandered across the stars? Yeah, exactly. So the radio stations make it feel like I'm going on this road trip. I guess my complaint with this is that there are only a handful of interviews and trailers where actual characters speak. For the most part, you'll be listening to some music track without any lyrics. And while it can feel relaxing as you go into the depths of space, it makes me feel like the radio stations could have been so much more. Also, the area you get to explore is quite limited, but it makes up for it by the multitude of tasks you get to perform. Sometimes the NPCs will ask you to move several signs to advertise their business, sometimes you need to kill a certain amount of enemies to get a Constructo mod, or sometimes you'll be assigned to shoot down several satellites to get a bucket of bolts. The space combat itself is the same as it was in previous entries, however, if you collect enough Zoni, you can gain upgrades for Aphelion like firing laser beams, launching proton missiles, and creating a force field. Overall, the space traversal and combat is the highlight of a Kraken time for me, and I can spend hours upon hours just traveling across the many galaxies, accomplishing tasks, and appreciating the vast scale of space. Clank's gameplay also gets revamped as well. Instead of controlling gadgetbots and telling them what to do, he can now create past recordings of himself in order to solve puzzles. Basically, he puts himself on one of the activators to record, and he uses that to make several past Clanks perform a multitude of functions, like standing on buttons to lower platforms, slowing down obstacles, and opening doors. While they start out simple enough, they eventually ramped up in difficulty to the point that you had to really start thinking about how your recordings functioned. Maybe you had to stand on a certain button for a longer period of time to get one of them across, or you had to have one recording do more than one action. Quite a few of these were brain ticklers that really made me think about how I wanted to approach them in order to get to the other side. He also gets to clear away time anomalies. These are minigames in which Clank uses the clock scepter to shoot at certain points that appear on a display of a certain planet. Probably the most interesting aspect about this minigame is that if you clear away an anomaly from one planet, when you return as Ratchet, you might find a previously inaccessible area opened up to reveal a gold bolt or Constructo mod. This gives a special purpose to the minigame. It doesn't feel like you're just doing it for nothing. Speaking of time anomalies, the game introduces levels where you have to go back in time to fix a certain problem. They kind of added an interesting dynamic in which if you change something in the past, it affects the present and vice versa. Sometimes it creates a special atmosphere. Xanathar is probably my favorite in this regard, since there's such a sharp contrast between what it was like in the two different time periods. The fact that the past introduced us to this happy, peaceful village makes it all the more saddening to see how it has devolved into a slave camp overrun with snow in the present. Gimlick Valley was more interesting from a gameplay point of view in the sense that in the past, you had to plant multiple seeds to create a vine. This changes the present in the sense that it creates a structure that wasn't there before. You use that to grind onto it to reach a higher elevation to fight the boss in the past to alter the outcome of the war. So it's a lot of going back and forth between past and present, and it helps make the level feel more creative than just shooting and platforming. There isn't really a whole lot to say about the gameplay besides that. They did improve the wrench throwing ability so that now Ratchet can move around while tossing it. The game brings back the arena challenges in the form of the Agorian Battleplex, and there's a healthy variety of activities, including trying to survive before time runs out, commandeering a turret to shoot down several projectiles coming your way, defeating waves of enemies while your gun switches on a whim, and so much more. I guess a new feature to the battle arena is the arcade challenge in My Blaster Runs Hot. If you get a certain amount of points, you get rewarded a trophy, and to this day I have nightmares of the many attempts it took trying to achieve this. It's a very simple arcade game that has you shooting enemies and rescuing civilians. There's nothing much to it. Finally, we get to the music, and this is the first game not to feature David Bergeau as the composer. Oh boy, is that a red flag. With Boris Salchow, it feels very cinematic. There's more of an emphasis on orchestral music this time around, and it's very generic. Nothing really stands out. Like, take the main theme for example. It has this dramatic opening with the trumpets as if this is a 20th Century Fox film. In fact, let's talk about how disappointed I am in this main menu. Usually in past Ratchet and Clank games, they often showed Ratchet doing a separate activity while the game waited for you to press the start button. It brought about this down-to-earthy kind of feel. But here it's just a plain title screen with Ratchet and Azimuth standing out in the distance while dramatic music plays. and it just feels like something was lost in translation. Anyway, Decrell Canyon Valley is another track that I felt fell victim to this. It used a different type of horn to demonstrate the intensity of the fighting, and just in general, it kind of feels like it's just playing the same note over and over. The fact that it's several measures of the same forte notes playing all at once is meant to emphasize the intensity of the battle, but it feels very repetitive to listen to. In the midst of combat, it's not very noticeable since you're too busy fighting, but that's the exact problem. The music just tends to fade into background. There's nothing particularly memorable or catchy here. It's almost as bad as corporate music. God, Insomniac wasn't even hiding how they were moving away from the consumeristic themes of previous entries.
Make it stop!
I did like the peaceful village music. It has a very nice melody that reflects one of serenity, with the oboe playing in the background as well as the harp that can barely be heard. This is probably one of the few tracks I'd put as actually good, mainly because it was trying to convey an actual theme. It was emphasizing a certain tone, and I wish Salchow had more tracks that were like this. So, the music overall, a step backwards for the franchise. As a matter of fact, this was probably the beginning of where you really felt like the series was headed to a more cinematic direction and away from its more down-to-earth nature. But, having said all that, this game is still a classic. I went into this worried that I would come out not liking A Crack in Time anymore, that it cared too many of the issues Tools of Destruction had, and if I were to be honest, I saw some of that. The whole Chosen One story for Clank was very ham-fisted. Azimuth being the second-to-last Lombax next to Ratchet is a bit of a coincidence, but the narrative still manages to be quite good, mainly because it takes all of this and really works with it. Azimuth's tragic backstory made us feel so intrigued of him that when he died, we actually felt something. The prospect of Clank leaving Ratchet was something that I don't think this series has ever grappled with before, and made the ending all the more poignant. The game feels even stronger with the gameplay, with all the galaxies to explore, and the many collectibles to achieve. They could have finished on a satisfying note if this had been it. Sure, maybe you could argue that if they ended here, it would have prevented new fans from coming in, but it would have given us the opportunity to look back at Ratchet and Clank fondly for what it was, and usually most franchises reap successful benefits from that line of thinking. Bionicle, for instance, chose to finish itself off as a series instead of continuing its story. Though a lot of old fans miss it, if they kept going, the story would have been even more convoluted, and the attempt to reboot it, well, failed miserably. The other example I'd use is The Legend of Spyro, which closed the story off on a good note. Spyro and Cinder are together, and there's no need to keep it going. I know I criticized the Legend of Spyro trilogy a lot, but the ending is something that brings a tear to my eye, and is perhaps one of the fonder moments within it. It finished with a bang, and it knew when to do it. The fact they didn't do this with A Crack in Time despite it being the perfect opportunity is questionable to me. We'll see what's next for the series, and if they can at least bring the Lombax arc to a full conclusion. And yeah, thanks so much for watching. Please don't forget to hit the like and subscribe. This is Dave Reviews, signing out.